after tonight, the recording will be online. But it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Ewing. Yeah, Ewing. All right. He's a professor in the Department of History at Virginia Tech and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Research for the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. He teaches courses in Russian, European, and world history. He's also the project director of Bike76 VA, which is what brings him here with us tonight. A Virginia Tech-led initiative that produces podcasts, weekly public essays, and funding for public exhibitions focused on historic biking tours across the Commonwealth. One such exhibit, which was created by Grace Krajewski. Yep. I believe it's one syllable in there. That's right. Under his guidance is on display now at the Salem Museum downstairs. So if you did not get a chance to check it out beforehand, please go downstairs to our ground floor afterwards or come back and visit us one day to check that out. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Should I use the microphone or is it all right?
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
That's all right.
This is our brand new technology. This is only our second So hopefully y'all could hear the announcements earlier. This is only our second event with this. Shout out to the Patterson Foundation and the good people at Stage down here in Roanoke who are helping us get hooked up with this from a grant through Patterson Foundation. So yes, thank you for that.
You're welcome. Is this volume good? Okay, it sounds really loud today, but
It is.
if I move it away, just let me know. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate Garrett and Hunter organizing this and posting the poster exhibit by Grace. This is really the first time in almost 30 years at Virginia Tech I've had a chance to work with museums and historical societies both in the area and across Virginia, and I've just been really impressed by what they're doing in connections with the community support from those who care about history. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this at the end. In this semi-quincentennial year, I really appreciated what these museums and historical societies have done to recognize this momentous event. So thank you all for coming. Almost everything I'm going to talk about is available on our website in some way. The QR code down here on the left should work. Got that on a lot of the slides. That's the website address. And then there's a whole table of things over there, which you are welcome to take. That includes some of the articles we've published, and also some stickers for those of you who are of the right generation to bike stickers, or you can take them and give them to your children, grandchildren, whoever likes stickers, or bookmarks if you like reading books, or anything else you want. And those also will have the QR code on them. So yeah, okay. So this is about the Bicentennial. How many of you are familiar with the word Bicentennial? One, two, okay, couple. So this was created in 1976, the year of the Bicentennial 200th anniversary. It was really the brainchild of four people, two married couples, Greg and Liz Burden, and Dan and Liz Burden, Jill and Greg Seipel, who were bicycling together in 1973 in something called the Transhemispheric bicycle ride or race. Transhemispheric meaning they started in Alaska and were going to Argentina. And apparently along the way they had to think about other things. And they came up with the idea of celebrating America's bicentennial by riding bikes across the country. And one of them, I think Jill, came up with the name Bikecentennial, combining the two words. And things happened. Some of them finished, some of them didn't, but they didn't give up on the idea. So starting in about 1974, they started organizing. They created an organization called the Bicentennial Organization. They started fundraising and they started advertising. And I believe it was $10. You could register your plans to ride. They put little postcard inserts into magazines, bicycling magazine in particular, but others. And they started to map out the route. And the route that you see on this map for the United States is pretty much the route that bikes followed in 1976. And the photograph in the bottom right is from the first group that left Jamestown in May of 1976, headed west, headed for Oregon. At the same time, other groups left Oregon, headed east, headed for Jamestown or Yorktown or Williamsburg or Chickahominy Boy Scout Camp. It was a little unclear where they ended up. And that happened all summer. There were groups leaving about every day, every couple of days, from both coasts. There were many who wanted to go all the way across the country, but the Bicentennial also organized what they called section routes, so a smaller 7-day, 10-day, 14-day trip. And one of the most popular was what they called the Colonial Route, which went from Jamestown to Radford, or went the other direction, or went both ways. And so this was, a thing in the summer of 1976. The best or the most consistent numbers that I've seen have been about 4,000 riders. And about half of them did the whole ride across the country, one way or the other, and then about half of them did a section route. You saw me hesitate there how to qualify that number. It's just an estimate. I think a lot of people quit. Almost every account I've seen from people who did ride said, yeah, there were others who started with us and they lasted a day or 3 days or whatever. I suspect there are others who rode without being registered. It was, after all, the 1970s. But pretty consistently, that number is what people estimate. So that's a pretty sizable event to celebrate America's 200th anniversary. This route still exists. The Adventure Cycling Association out of Missoula, Montana, continued the work of the Bicentennial organization, and both the Simples and the Burdens helped form this organization. Now they do trips, all kinds of trips all over the country, internationally. They also publish and sell maps of different sections of this, what they generally call the TransAmerica Bicycle Trail, but was also recognized in the 1990s as U.S. Bicycle Route 76. And so if you're familiar in this area with signs with the bicycle on the top and the 76 on the bottom, that's the designation, U.S. Bicycle Route 76, that goes excuse me, all across the country. This is the route in Virginia. So you can see where it starts over in Jamestown, Yorktown, Williamsburg area. It goes along north of the James River. The route was mapped to keep cyclists away from cities, to have them go through rural America, stay on less traveled roads. Obviously, they didn't ride on interstates. Beyond that, it was a little unclear what they were trying to do. And it's never been exactly clear to me why the Virginia route is so kind of loopy. They went up to Missoula, Montana, because that's where the organization was. So that's actually a pretty substantial detour, but it kind of makes sense. But from Kentucky to southern Colorado, it's pretty much a straight line. But for some reason, the Virginia route starts in Yorktown, Jamestown, goes around Richmond, and then goes way up in Lisa County around Lake Anna. It goes through Charlottesville, and then it comes down the west side of the Blue Ridge, and then it goes all the way down to Damascus and Mount Rogers, and then goes up and leaves and breaks Interstate Park. So I've never found a good explanation for why there was that kind of not really the most direct route. Obviously, with the valleys, there's a certain logic to going up and down that way, but there are plenty of hills. So this is not a route that is designed to avoid climbs or anything else. It's about 550 miles in Virginia. So there are other states that have obviously more miles just because of the size of the state. But this is a pretty substantial chunk. It's about a little bit more than 10% of the whole route, which is just over 4,000 miles. Around here, you're probably familiar, with some of the route. It comes down from Lexington, more or less follows Route 11. There are a couple sections where it goes into some really beautiful back roads off of Route 11, and then there are sections where it's right on Route 11. It's a little unnerving. And then it leaves 11 and goes across something called Valley Road, which takes you through Troutville and Daleville, and then gets you onto Catawba Road, and it goes around Tinker Mountain, and then it goes all the way down the Catawba Valley to just north of Blacksburg, where I live, goes through downtown Christiansburg, and then heads west to Radford and on down. So Roanoke, being a large city, is not on the route. Again, it skips Richmond. It doesn't go anywhere near Washington, D.C. It doesn't go through Stanton or Roanoke and some of the other cities. Virginia being weird with cities and towns, there are 3 cities where Route 76 goes directly through the city: Charlottesville, Lexington, and Radford. But then there are some towns where it does go right through: Christiansburg, Wytheville, and Troutville, some of the others. So it's mostly rural roads. And so that's pretty much the route that the Bicentennial took 50 years ago, and it's now US Bicycle Route 76 to Virginia. So let me talk a little bit what I'm going to do today. I'm going to do all these pretty quickly, but I'm very happy to come back when we have questions and talk about anything more in these sections. And like I said, there's a lot of materials over there. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came up with this project, not far from here in the Catawba Valley. We're going to talk about some of the components of the project that are on the website, and also the poster exhibit that's downstairs. And then I'm going to finish by talking about 2 things. One is the commemorations, the Bicentennial 1976, 50 years ago, and then the 250th anniversary that we're going through now, and then a little bit about the implications for how we think about bicycling. And so, like I said, this is a lot of what I'm going to cover is on the website. I call this talk a winding, rolling route, and I'll come back and talk about that phrase towards the end. But this project really began in the Catawba Valley, and these are just some photos, different sections of that route, if you're all familiar with. A very convenient way to get to Blacksburg, Christiansburg if you want to avoid 81, but also a beautiful place to cycle. And I know cyclists from Roanoke and Salem go on this route also because it's accessible, obviously, from here as well as Blacksburg and Christiansburg. But about 11 years ago, 2015, I had one of those big birthdays, and my wife, who is always very wise, encouraged me to get a road bicycle. I'd always had a bicycle. I rode a bicycle to and from campus to go to work. But this was the first time I really had a bicycle to go and explore and get exercise. And I discovered this was my favorite place to ride, was to leave Blacksburg and go north along this valley and turn and come back. And while riding, obviously I had plenty of time to think. I started to think about this historic route that was not only had been there for 50 years, but also connected literally one direction all the way to Jamestown, Yorktown, and the other direction all the way to Oregon, all the way across the country. And I also started to think about history along that route, and all the places in Virginia that, had these historical connections. And so I started to think about like how can I share this history? What could I do? And I have done in the past workshops for K-12 teachers and other kinds of professional activities. And so I was initially thinking about, a summer program or a trip or something else. And then I'm like, no, I don't have the skills to lead a bike trip. And it's also, I had done some summer programs, and they're great for people who do them. But they're kind of ephemeral, like what's left, when you finish that. And so at some point, probably while riding a bicycle, I came up with the idea of doing a historical podcast, and thinking about how there are all of these historical connections that could be encountered along these 550 miles of US Bicycle Route 76 in Virginia. And for any of you, those of you who do any kind of long distance road cycling, 60 to 80 miles is a very reasonable kind of day to think about doing. It's a long day, it's a hard day, but it's pretty appropriate. And so I thought, well, if you did an episode every 20 miles, that would be 3 or 4 episodes a day. So if you're thinking about a podcast and listening, and there's 550 miles divided by 20, doing historians math, it came out to be about 30 episodes. And I thought, well, could I come up with 30 topics that connected to particular locations all the way along this route? And the answer was, yeah, I could actually. And it helped that where I was bicycling had 2 locations where I had actually done some research and some publications. One was in Christiansburg, because the bicycle route 76 in Christiansburg goes right through the downtown, which meant it was literally on the historic campus of the Christiansburg Industrial Institute, which was the school created in 1866 for the children of the freed, formerly enslaved people in Montgomery County. That began with the Federal Freedmen's Bureau, and then the Friends Freedmen's picked it up, and it educated children for a century until school integration in the 1960s, and the school was closed down. And so I knew something about that history and thought, here are these cyclists coming through downtown Christiansburg. They may not know anything about this. This would be a good thing for them to know about. And then about 20 miles north, in the Catawba Valley, is the Catawba Tuberculosis Sanatorium, which was created in 1909 by the state government to treat patients with tuberculosis, which was at the time the single most deadly disease for Americans. And it was put there because it was in a remote location. It was at altitude. It was surrounded by farmland. It was fresh air. It was not terribly convenient for anybody, but that was the idea of how to treat tuberculosis patients. Get them out of the city, get them into fresh air, and then don't let them do anything. So the rules of the sanatorium required as much rest as possible, sometimes as much as 16 or 18 hours. So you got good food, you got good medical attention, and then you did nothing as long as possible. And I was really struck by that because not only was it right on the bicycle route 76, which of course is the opposite philosophy, right? Good health comes from strenuous physical activity. But the sanatorium is in the same valley as McAfee Knob and the Appalachian Trail, which again has that same philosophy of strenuous physical activity is the key to health. So I already had my first 2 episodes, 20 miles apart. And so it was just a matter of coming up with another 28. And so that's what we did. And Grace Kostrevsky, who Garrett mentioned, came on as a research assistant in her freshman year at Virginia Tech class. She's such a fabulous student. And so she researched and wrote 3 of the episodes. And then Joe Forts, who's the media manager in the Virginia Tech Library, recorded all of them and produced them and put them on various podcasting platforms. And so they've been there for more than a year. And that's really the heart of the project. And so anyone that wants to know more about Bicycle Route 76 in Virginia or about Virginia history is welcome to go and look at these. And they cover more than 500 years of Virginia history, even though they're tied to the Bicentennial, the 200th, now the semi-quincentennial year. They go much earlier in terms of looking at indigenous people before European settlement, European conquest. And they go right up to the 20th century, into the 21st century. So the Troutful episode, just north of here, looks at suburbs. And how much Virginia has changed in the 50 years since the Bicentennial in 1976, which is one way the tremendous growth of suburbs like Botetourt County outside of Roanoke and other places, but also what that's meant for bicycling. That in some ways the growth of suburbs should have, encouraged that kind of alternative transportation, but in other ways it didn't. In some ways it actually made it harder for you to get around by bicycles until what we've seen in the last few years, which I'm going to talk about, of creating greenways and other kinds of access points The Radford episode starts by contrasting the new River Medical Center, which is right there on Interstate 81, a huge complex, place I've gone for treatment, to what was there 50 years ago, which was a downtown hospital, Radford Hospital, right in the middle of the community. And so it sort of talks about this change in kind of attitudes towards health and healthcare, but then it really looks at opioids and what's happened in the last 20 years in Appalachia and the kind of the impact of that public health crisis and its connections to the region. The Buchanan looks at the life of Mary Johnson, an advocate for women's suffrage, and then the Natural Bridge episode obviously looks at Natural Bridge, but also the connections between that as part of the walking paths for Indigenous people before European settlement. And so you get some sense of the range of topics, and I'm happy to come back and talk more about those. They're all between 15 and 20 minutes long, so they're relatively short as podcasts go. Again, the idea being, you could listen to them kind of as you're traveling. These are the posters, which are exhibited downstairs. Do you have all of them, or did you get a selection? I don't remember.
We got all.
You got all of them. Okay. And like I said, this was something that Grace Kostretsky, really did all of the work on, designing the posters, thinking about the topics, putting together the materials, consulting with a lot of museum directors and historical societies as she was developing them, also with colleagues and fellow students at Virginia Tech. And the idea, as you can tell, is for each of them, she took a map of Virginia, put the Route 76, superposed it on it, and then talked about the history that's revealed in that map. And so if you haven't seen the exhibit yet, this is one of the ones she looks at with Indigenous roads and talking about the connections between these different regions before European settlement and how this is part of Virginia history. She looks at the Revolutionary era and the ways that there was this resistance to tyranny in different parts of Virginia. And then I actually contributed to this one. I'll have to take some of the blame. Some of the celebrations in 1976 with the Bicentennial and this blue map, that is the official Virginia transportation map from 1975, the VDOT map. The next year, 1976, it's the same map, except it's red. It's really quite garish. You can find it on the VDOT website. But one of the things that interested us, and I've been thinking a lot about this over the last couple of months, the story that Virginians told in 1976 was in some ways a very traditional one. Really emphasized the founding fathers and emphasized the colonial heritage. Obviously, the key sites in the revolution and also the revolutionary figures. But there's almost no mention of slavery, of enslaved people, of indigenous populations before the revolution. And so, a very obvious example of this is the Route 76 goes right past Monticello in Charlottesville. So a lot of talk about Jefferson and all of the cyclists stopped and looked. No mention of the Hemmings family, of Sally Hemings, of the children, or of enslaved people. And so, one of the things that Grace wanted to do in this poster is think about how our understanding of history changed in the last 50 years. As we go back and tell these stories and think about these issues from 250 years ago, what has changed in our understanding of that history. So we have all of these on the website. If you haven't had a chance to look at them, if you want to look at them in more detail. We also set ourselves a challenge of writing an essay every week about this project. So we started in January 2025, and we kept going right through the end of June 2026. And so all of those are on the website. And then this past spring, we pull all of them together into a single document. I've got one copy back there. It's also on the website as a PDF. That really looks at, we started, as you can tell, with the Fincastle resolutions, 250 years ago in the spring of 1775, and some of those commemorations. We did the occasional foray into news. So as you may recall, President Carter died in early January 2025, and he was an avid cyclist, proponent of bicycling. So we wrote about that. Watch for Dogs. That was one I wrote. But we really wanted to think about the history of cycling, the connections to American history and these different commemorations, and then also to the Bicentennial itself, and especially this past spring. We wrote a lot of stories about bicyclists in 1976 and what they encountered in Virginia, and what they saw. And so this is the cover. Like I said, there's a copy back there. The pedals, public exhibitions displays art and logos. Virginia Tech provided funding, and then we also had a grant from the Virginia Association of Museums. And we ended up funding 10 projects along the route, from starting in Damascus in the west, several in the New River Valley, Roanoke Valley, Lexington, and then 3 Henrico, James City, and Jamestown. And so these are different things. There's a couple of murals that are being painted. There are exhibit signs that are being put up in these locations. And then what just happened last week, losing track, in Daleville, they put up an actual historical marker for the Bicentennial, the TransAmerica Bicycle Trail, which is on Catawba Road, so right on Route 76. Jennifer Lee Paulson, who owns the property, not only arranged to have it put on her property, but also raised the funds for the historic marker. And then she got a grant, or the Bonnetop Historical Society got a grant from our project to put up this bench that says "Welcome to Bonnetop" and has a map of Route 76 on it. So we had an opening ceremony or an unveiling for that a week ago, and there was a bicycle group that came through that was part of that. And then we've also been publishing articles. So this was one of the first ones we did in May of 2025 in the Roanoke Times, where we talked about this route and its connections to this region, and also the links back to 1976. And at that point, looking ahead to 2026. This is one of my favorite stories. Clarence Pickard, 86 years old in 1976, among the first groups to start the Bicentennial in Jamestown. He was drafted into World War I, but only saw short service before the war ended. Became an agricultural extension agent, worked at Virginia Polytechnic Institute in the 1920s, and then went to Iowa, where he was from, and worked at Iowa State in that job, worked for the government, and ran a farm. And then when he retired in the 1960s, he and his wife joined the Peace Corps, and spent 2 years in India. And then at the age of 83, he rode in the first, what's called Rag Ride, which is the ride across Iowa. And he thought, well, I've ridden across Iowa, why not ride across the country? And so he showed up in Jamestown with the only bicycle that would fit him, which was at the time called a ladies' bike. You're familiar with what those look like. Tennis shoes and a pith helmet that he had brought back with him from the Peace Corps. He was quite a character. He rode slower than anyone in his group, which was good because he got lost a lot. And so he could at any point stop and say, did some cyclists come through? And they would say, oh, yes. And it's okay, not lost. Or if they said no, he would get directions. When he got to Blacksburg, he took a detour and gave a lecture to the students about how to live a long time and stay healthy. And we read about this in the article, he was a real proponent for cycling. He really believed it was good exercise. It gave you a sense of freedom. It gave you a sense of, of independence. Unfortunately, by the time he got to Kentucky, he was pretty sick. He had bronchitis. And so his son, who was a doctor, basically came and got him, said, stop riding. So he gave up. He didn't make it across the country, and died a few years later. But I really like this story of someone who, had this commitment to a lifetime of exercise, but also education, and kind of trying to get others to follow in the same route. And then this one appeared just a few weeks ago, and it was about a cyclist named Jane McGuire, who was a newspaper correspondent in New Jersey, who came down in the summer 1976 to just ride the Virginia section, Colonial Route. So they started in Jamestown and ended up in Radford. But she starts her article by talking about being in this luncheonette in Troutville, and Country Roads came on, and she said the jukebox. And they all started singing along, and one of them said, it could be our theme song because they were riding on country roads. And so we used that kind of story from 1976, to talk about not only the Bicentennial as this way to celebrate America's 200th anniversary, but also what local organizations are doing now in 2026 to celebrate the 70th centennial. And this was actually inspired by an editorial that the Roanoke Times editor, Brian Kelly, wrote about how important it was to celebrate this anniversary, but to do it at the local level, the regional level, to really kind of focus there. And so we kind of use that to inspire. There were two illustrations in the article. The one that was published in the Roanoke Times is this kind of stylized map of Virginia, which is kind of too fat and not tall enough, or I don't know, I quite never figured out. But I really like the mountains. But then the illustration in the bottom right was also part of this newspaper article. So I have borrowed it for some stickers and some other things, because I just really like this image of a long distance cyclist, all loaded down with things, but clearly game for adventure. And I am obligated, both as a cyclist and a parent, to say she's not wearing a helmet. And she should be. But that was actually very uncommon in the 1970s. I looked at a lot of pictures, and I would say maybe 1 in 10 of the cyclists are wearing helmets. There were helmets. It was just not a common thing to do. Okay, brings me to my last 2 points. 1976 and 2026. When I started this, kind of thinking about what to do with the Public History Project, I was looking ahead to this year. And thinking about how Americans would celebrate this 250th anniversary, because that was such a key part of 1976, was to really feel like, how do we recognize this milestone? How do we think about, this kind of transformational moment? We do that by looking at America, in many cases, spending 2 or 3 months doing that from the seat of a bicycle. And I didn't know, when I was thinking about this in 2018 or 2019 or even 2021, what the state of the country would be in 2026. And I still don't know. But I guess I was struck. This is the Roanoke Times front page on July 5th, 1976, the day after the July 4th Bicentennial. Rare joy highlights Bicentennial. And they talk about, a day to be savored. All day strangers, wherever they met, wished each other happy birthday. For a nation grown accustomed to ferment and torment, this was almost a totally happy and peaceful day. Protests and dissents were muted. And then this is a cartoon from the Roanoke Times by Oliphant, who was a very famous political cartoonist in the 1970s, with the entire world wishing the United States, Democrats and Republicans, a happy birthday. So I'm not sure we achieved that same level of unity this year, or celebration. I don't know. But it's been helpful for me, like I said, to appreciate what is being done at the local level, the regional level, to recognize this anniversary, and to think about, what lesson. This point is too late, but maybe we could have learned from the celebration in 1976. I do think a place where there is a clear legacy has to do with cycling and cycling infrastructure or cycling arrangements. The title that I gave Garrett and Hunter, a winding, rolling route. I should have practiced saying. It's a weird combination of rhyme and then alliteration. I don't know. This came from the Roanoke Times, October 17th, 1976. And the Roanoke Times actually had a bunch of articles about the Bicentennial. They talked about the planning stages and looking for riders in 1975, early 1976. As riders came through the region, they often wrote about them. Sometimes they picked up wire sort of stories from other places. Like I said, they wrote about Clarence Pickard when he came through. And then in the fall, they had this article which talked about all the places to bicycle in the area, including the Blue Ridge Parkway. And specifically, they talked about the Bicentennial Trail. First part is actually, okay, the crowds are gone. All those people that came through in the summer, they're gone, but the route is still there. And the bike route signs, which were put up both by the Bicentennial organization, but also by VDOT, contributed to those stayed up. Eventually, they came down and were replaced by the US Bicycle Route 76 signs, but the Bicentennial ones were there. And they talked specifically about riding through the Catawba Valley. The rider here traverses a winding, rolling route that penetrates the Pleasant Farm Valley with a backdrop of colorful mountains on either side. That's still true. That valley looks, I think, a lot like it did 50 years ago. Catawba Community Center was a school in 1976. It was still an elementary school. But otherwise, and the Catawba General Store was functioning in 1976. It went out of business probably 20 years ago. But in many ways, that feels like the same place. But there's a lot that's changed. So in 1976, there were maybe 20 miles of designated bike routes in Virginia. The Mount Vernon Trail in Alexandria, down to Mount Vernon along the river, the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, and then like a couple others. There was almost nothing for cyclists. That's why they were on the roads. Now, I don't, I put 1,000 plus. I have no idea how you can count because there's almost 800 miles between US Bicycle Route 76 and US Bicycle Route 1. Plus, think about all the rails to trails, the New River Trail, the Creeper Trail, the Washington Dominion Trail, the Hybrids Trail, the Capitol Bike Trail, which now runs from Richmond to Jamestown. All of the greenways, including here in the Roanoke Valley, plus mountain bike trails. It's just extraordinary how much things have changed in 50 years, including I was delighted to see a designated bike lane out here on this road. And so I think that's something that the Bicentennial contributed to. The 1970s were a kind of boom period for cycling. The advent of 10 speeds made it possible for people to ride further. Bicycling shifted from something that was primarily what kids did, in the 1950s and 1960s to becoming something that adults did. And it became a way to commute, to get around. And the oil shock of the 1970s, the OPEC oil embargo, and then the Iran crisis certainly encouraged people to look at cycling. Obviously, that goes away in some ways in the 1980s, 1990s, but it's really come back. And so, when I think about the Bicentennial, this to me is one of the most important kind of legacies of that was this idea, of bicycles not only as a way to get around, but a way to see the country, to appreciate where people live, enjoy the landscape, but also connect with communities. And that's something that I've really enjoyed with this project. And then through these different resources, we hope to encourage others to do as well. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions, comments, observations, your thoughts, whatever. And are people going to pick this up on Zoom, or should I repeat them, or just make it up as we go?
If there are questions, I'll bring them up.
Okay.
Have there been any organized rides, like people coming through here and camping, everything like that?
So I know 2 rides that have already been through. A group from the Williamsburg area bicyclists drove over to Withville and rode back to Williamsburg in June. And then a Magical Mystery Bicycle Tours, which is organized here out of Roanoke, they did the whole route. I can tell you 2 things happened. The Williamsburg area group ran into some norovirus, and which made people sick, including me. And the second trip ran into the really awful heat of the past week and the storms. But I know they both made it to Williamsburg. I don't know beyond that. So the Adventure Cycling Association organized a 50th anniversary ride. They did not come through Virginia. They started in Washington, D.C., went up the C&O Canal and then the Great Allegheny Passage to Pittsburgh, and then took trails across Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri, and then connected in, I think, southern Colorado and did the rest of the route. And so, that would have been an obvious connection, but they didn't want to come this way. And I understand why. As you could hear me say when I was talking about the route from Troutville to Lexington, some of it is on pretty busy roads. And there are sections down towards Withville where you're riding, you're obviously never on the interstate, but there are places where you have to ride past an interstate interchange, and so I can see why being on designated bicycle routes would seem safer and easier. But I do think it's a shame. There would have been an opportunity to celebrate this ride and bring more attention to it. Those are the only ones I know of. Yeah.
You have a question from Zoom.
Okay.
From Marla. Where does the project and the research go from here?
We are pretty much done. Yeah. This was really designed to kind of culminate at this point with the July 4th semi-quincentennial. I think all of the museums that are showing that have the posters up will have them up for some period of time, but forever, obviously. And I don't think we'll do much more. I'm still interested in the route and obviously happy to talk to anybody or ride on it. But I sort of feel like there was a certain time period where it made sense to do this. So that's kind of where we are. I've got Grace involved in another project. Yeah.
How about accommodations? I mean, did everybody just take a tent? In 76, was there a big difference in 76 and this year?
So one of the things that's been interesting, there are Bicentennial riders still around. And so one of them was on this trip I did with the Williamsburg group. Another came to Daleville for the unveiling. There's another guy up in Lexington who I ran into while I was riding a bike. And they've talked about their experience. And then I've also obviously read a lot of newspaper articles. There were different tiers of the ride. And actually not that different from what we have now. There were some, like our friend Jane here, who carried everything. And so they camped. And so they had a tent, a sleeping bag, or whatever. I think the most common, and both of the riders I talked to did this, was they paid a little bit more money and had lodging arranged by the Bicentennial organization. They still carried their stuff, but there was supposed to be a place to stay. What did that mean? There were a few places that had bike hostels, so there were actually beds for them to sleep on. Much more commonly, it was the floor of a gymnasium or a church or a town hall or some other municipal building or a college dormitory or a fraternity. And so the Bicentennial organization arranged with these groups, and so they would be told, okay, here's the town you're going to, here's where you're going to stay. It didn't always work out. I think especially the first groups that went through sometimes showed up and no one was expecting them. But that's generally what they did. And then there were actually some groups where they had a vehicle carrying their stuff. So they kind of had different levels. But this is what the Bicentennial organization spent more than a year organizing. They sent people out to scout the route, but then also make these arrangements. they relied a lot on bicycle shop owners in the area who knew or bicycle organizations. And some of the bike organizations, I'm not sure about the Roanoke one, this is really when they got their start in the 1970s. And so there was a very small number, but there were cyclists there who would help figure out where they could stay. But yeah, I didn't have it in this presentation. I did another presentation in Lexington, and one of the photographs I had from 1976 showed 3 or 4 people standing on bicycles, all of them looking at a map, a paper map. And Rick, who had ridden it 50 years, started laughing, and he said, every day we spent countless hours staring at a map, figuring out where we were and where we were supposed to go. So I think it was kind of a mix, that there definitely were some logistical issues, but generally both the riders at the time really felt like it worked out.
So not like the Appalachian Trail or the Camino de Santiago in Spain.
In what way?
Oh, I mean, those are marked every,
Yeah.
On the pavements or on the trees.
Yes.
Yeah,
No,
so
there's
hard
yeah.
to do that.
It's-
Those are walking
Yeah.
trails.
Yeah, it's pretty hit or miss. At the time it was on this. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
And there were riders now or less than 1976.
Last,
Really?
yeah.
Really?
I mean, in terms of this doing the TransAmerica project, in 19 if you lived in a town on the Bicentennial 1976, from everything I've seen, you expected to see 15 or 20 people riding through every day, and sometimes more than that. And so I did the whole route last summer with my brother who came down from New Hampshire. And so we were riding for 10 days. We saw 5 people who looked like they were doing a long distance ride. And again, if you're anywhere near the Appalachian Trail, particularly in the spring in this area, you're going to see 100 hikers on the same day. So a different question, are there more people bicycling now than 1970s?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, many, many more. It's just a different kind
Like
of
the ride between Blacksburg and Lexington, like we did it all the time back 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
It's a big deal now.
Yeah. No, I think there are many more riders, but there are more places to ride and more kinds of bicycles and so on. So that's a real shift. I mean, obviously, there were no mountain bikes in the 1970s. Don't come until the 1990s, and they got really popular after that. And so you pretty much had to be on the road with those kinds of bicycles.
Yeah. We have, sorry, well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was involved with this in 75 and 76.
Okay.
The Bicentennial organization in Montana put out a call to bike clubs around the country
Okay.
requesting they submit routes for consideration. And I spent many weekends over a period of months riding around the area, exploring, just seeing what I thought might work. And I laid out a section from Christiansburg to Waynesboro.
Okay.
And 2 of my favorite parts of that, one is the Catawba Valley section, the other one is from Troutville to Buchanan. It kind of follows a creek along the way, parallel to 11. You get into a nice cadence there and just kind of cruise. But we submitted through our local bike club, we're out to Missoula, and they accepted it. And I'm sure many other clubs did the same thing. But when I saw the first 76 sign go up, oh, nice.
Yeah.
But it was quite an accomplishment for this organization to come up with this kind of a route. And is it perfect? No. There were roads then that were not heavily traveled that are now, and a lot has changed in that time period. The Catawba Road is one of those. Back then, it was not heavily traveled, and now you've got concrete trucks and all kinds of things barreling down the road.
Yeah.
But it's nice that people are still riding. I'd see people come through. I'm from Lexington. I'd see them come through with panniers, and I mean, obviously they were doing a distance.
Yeah.
On the road.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your work 50 years ago. And I think what you're saying is exactly right. You know, the national organizers did rely on people like you who knew the area. And when it looked like we wrote an article for the Montgomery News Messenger, and you may have known this at the time. There was a disagreement about the route from leaving Christiansburg, which goes out on something called Mud Bike Road. And the people who lived in that road said, it's not safe for cyclists. You should go a different way. And it was actually too late by then. They'd already put up the signs and, you know, kind of ignored what the county supervisor said. So I agree with you, you know, that there are places where the route has changed. The section from, so when it comes out of Louisa County, it goes to Ashland, north of Richmond, and then goes through Henrico County and then connects with Route 5 that goes towards Williamsburg. And the cyclists who had ridden all the way across the country, when they got to that section, they said, this traffic's horrible. In fact, that was the section they really didn't like, just because there's so many vehicles on it. And now that's the Capitol Bike Trail. So it's a wonderful route to ride on. But that's really the only section that I know of in Virginia where you could say, okay, here's a bike trail that we could ride on instead. The Huckleberry Trail that goes from Christiansburg through Blacksburg kind of does that. There's a 2-mile section of the new river trail that run parallel. And when you leave Damascus going east and you go up White Top Mountain, now the Virginia Creeper Trail runs the same way, although now obviously it's closed. But there really aren't good bike trail alternatives to this route, except that Capitol Bike Trail is 30 miles now. You know, and so I think this is, people ask me, is it safe to ride on the route? I'm like, well, I did. I must think it's safe. I was okay. But in other ways, I am cautious about it. And the section you just mentioned, you know, when you leave Route 11 to go, you know, on those back roads, those are absolutely beautiful. You know, it's a lovely scenic route. It's very low traffic. You cross the railroad track about every 3 miles, but it's fine. But then you come back on 11, you know, and you have to go on that. So, and 11, let's see, 50 years ago, Interstate 81 was finished in that section. So the traffic had already been moved off of 11. But I think it was a hard thing for them to figure out, you know, like what's the balance between, you know, the most direct route as opposed to a more scenic route and then a safer route. And they had to, as any cyclists do now, they had to choose between those. The one thing the cyclists hated in 1976 were the coal trucks, and particularly in Eastern Kentucky. And they were afraid of them because these were extremely heavily loaded trucks. They weren't necessarily that large, but they were, you know, quite dangerous. And actually, you may know this. One of their earliest routes went through Waynesboro into West Virginia, and then connected to Kentucky, and then that disappeared at some point. And I think they decided it wasn't safe to take cyclists, and so they went back through Virginia and then into Kentucky at breaks. And that obviously has changed. You know, there's not nearly the same volume of coal mining, therefore coal trucks, as there was 50 years ago. But I will say that the route from Damascus to Breaks, which is mostly Route 80, was not my favorite part of the ride. It's very beautiful, but there's a lot of traffic because it's the only way to get, you know, from here to there. So there are a lot of trucks and other things. And so, and this kind of goes back to this question of why aren't more people riding on the route? Well, there are other places that are safer, and certainly, easier to ride on and so on. But, I think this point I was trying to make here, what bicycling clubs like yours were doing in the 1970s, probably at the time felt like there weren't many people doing this. And it may have felt like Sisyphus pushing the rock up, but it made a big difference. The organizations that kept going and kept the pressure on local governments to provide these safe cycling options have made a huge difference. And now I think planners and developers and people who are building housing and building businesses recognize there's real value to being in proximity to these multi-use paths that bring cyclists, but also walkers and others. And that's such a shift from 50 years ago. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
All right, so thank you all so much for coming out. We're going to end the recording. But as always,